The police sirens wailed as Sarah watched her neighbor Karen point an accusing finger at her empty backyard, screaming about property damage and lawsuits. But Karen had no idea that Sarah's security cameras had been rolling for weeks, capturing every single one of her neighbor's late-night secrets. As the floodwaters receded and the truth began to surface, Karen's perfect suburban facade was about to crumble faster than the foundation of her own home. The morning Sarah Mitchell decided to drain her above-ground pool, she had no idea it would unleash 3 years of neighborhood hell. She stood in her backyard at 6 a.m., coffee mug steaming in the crisp September air, watching the first golden rays of sunlight dance across the water's surface. The pool had been her sanctuary during the pandemic, a 24-foot circle of chlorinated peace that had kept her sane through lockdown. But now, with autumn approaching and her promotion requiring longer hours at the accounting firm, it was time to let it go. "Just flip the valve and let it drain into the street," her brother Mike had told her over the phone the night before. "Everyone does it. City storm drains can handle it." Sarah had checked the city ordinances online. Technically, pool water could be discharged into storm drains as long as it had been dechlorinated for at least a week. She'd stopped adding chemicals 10 days ago, tested the water twice. Everything was by the book. She opened the drainage valve and watched the water begin its slow journey through the hose, across her driveway, and into the storm grate at the curb. At this rate, it would take 6 hours to empty completely. Perfect timing. She'd be back from her Saturday errands just as it finished. What Sarah didn't know was that Karen Pemberton from 42 Maple Lane had been watching her from behind her kitchen curtains for the past 20 minutes. Karen had moved to Willowbrook subdivision 5 years ago with her husband Dennis and their twin daughters, expecting the kind of suburban paradise she'd seen in home improvement magazines. Instead, she'd found herself surrounded by what she considered inconsiderate neighbors who didn't share her vision of property value perfection. There was Mrs. Chen, who insisted on hanging laundry outside instead of using her perfectly good dryer. The Johnsons, whose teenage son played basketball in their driveway until all hours. And worst of all, Sarah Mitchell, the single woman next door who had the audacity to install that eyesore of a pool without asking anyone's permission. Karen had filed complaints with the HOA about the pool 3 times. Each time, she was told the same thing. Sarah's property was grandfathered in before the no above-ground pools rule was implemented. The pool was legal, properly maintained, and none of Karen's business. But this morning, watching the water flow from Sarah's property toward the street, Karen saw her opportunity. She threw on her robe and marched outside, her slippers slapping against the wet asphalt. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Sarah looked up from adjusting the hose position. "Oh, hi, Karen. Just draining the pool for the season." "Draining it where exactly?" Karen's arms crossed over her chest, her perfectly styled blonde hair somehow maintaining its shape despite the morning humidity. "Into the storm drain. It's all legal, I checked." "Legal?" Karen's voice rose an octave. "You're flooding the entire street. Do you have any idea what this could do to our foundations? Our landscaping?" Sarah glanced around. The water was flowing in a neat stream along the gutter, disappearing into the storm grate just as it was supposed to. "Karen, it's just pool water. The storm system is designed for this." "Don't you dare lecture me about storm systems," Karen snapped. "My Dennis works in municipal engineering. I know exactly what this kind of irresponsible water discharge can do to a neighborhood's infrastructure." That was a lie. Dennis worked in IT for the county clerk's office, but Karen had learned that adding authority to her voice made people back down faster. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. 3 years of Karen's complaints about her garden, her car, her work schedule, and now this. "The water has been dechlorinated for over a week. I followed all the guidelines." "Guidelines?" Karen laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "There are laws about this kind of thing. Environmental regulations. You can't just dump thousands of gallons of chemically treated water into our storm system." "I tested it. The chlorine levels are—" "I don't care what your little test strips say," Karen interrupted. "I'm calling the city, and my lawyer." Sarah set down her coffee mug with, Deliberate care. Your lawyer? Property damage, Sarah. When this water undermines the street and floods basements, when it kills the landscaping and creates foundation problems, you're going to be liable for every penny. Karen's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. I hope that pool was worth it because it's about to cost you your house. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah had worked 2 jobs to afford this modest 3-bedroom home after her divorce. The thought of losing it over draining a pool made her stomach clench. You know what? Karen continued, pulling out her phone. I'm documenting this right now. Time-stamped photos, video evidence. My dentist says that's crucial for liability cases. Sarah watched Karen start recording, narrating like she was reporting breaking news. This is Karen Pemberton at 42 Maple Lane, documenting the illegal dumping of pool chemicals by my neighbor Sarah Mitchell. As you can see, thousands of gallons of contaminated water are flooding our street. Karen, stop. Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. You're being ridiculous. Ridiculous? Karen lowered her phone just long enough to glare. We'll see how ridiculous it is when Channel 7 News does a story about environmental crimes in Willowbrook. I have contacts at the station, you know. That was another lie, but Karen had perfected the art of fabricated authority. Sarah felt something snap inside her chest, the same feeling she'd had the day her ex-husband told her he was leaving, taking half of everything they'd built together. The same helpless rage that had consumed her during the custody battle she couldn't afford to fight. But this time was different. This time she wasn't going to roll over. You know what, Karen? Sarah walked toward her fence line, her voice dropping to conversational tone. You should definitely call whoever you want. Document everything. Make sure you get it all on record. Karen blinked, clearly expecting more of a fight. Well, good. I'm glad you're finally seeing reason. Oh, I'm seeing lots of things clearly now. Sarah smiled, the expression sharp as winter. In fact, I think you'll find the next few hours very educational. Karen frowned, sensing something had shifted but not understanding what. What's that supposed to mean? Sarah picked up her coffee mug and headed toward her back door. Nothing. At all, Karen. You just keep recording. Make sure you capture everything that happens today. As Sarah disappeared into her house, Karen felt a flicker of unease, but she pushed it aside, already mentally composing the social media posts that would rally the neighborhood to her cause. She had Sarah exactly where she wanted her. What Karen didn't know was that Sarah had installed a comprehensive security camera system 6 months ago after someone had been stealing packages from her front porch. 4 cameras with night vision, motion sensors, and crystal clear audio recording. And for the past 3 weeks, those cameras had been capturing Karen's late-night activities in vivid detail. Activities that would make Karen's husband, Dennis, very, very interested in having a conversation with his wife. Sarah poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and settled in at her kitchen table with her laptop. Time to review some footage. After all, Karen had just given her explicit permission to document everything. The pool continued to drain steadily into the storm system, exactly as designed, while Karen stood in the street making her recordings, completely unaware that her perfect suburban life was about to implode in ways she never could have imagined. 2 hours later, Karen had transformed from neighborhood watchdog into a one-woman media circus. She'd called the city environmental department, the HOA president, and her sister-in-law, who worked for a local news station. Each conversation had grown more dramatic, with Karen painting herself as the heroic defender of Willowbrook's property values against Sarah's reckless environmental terrorism. You should see the flooding, Janet, Karen said into her phone, pacing her front lawn while keeping one eye on Sarah's driveway. It's like a river running down our street. The Hendersons' rose bushes are completely underwater. Through her kitchen window, Sarah could see the Hendersons' roses standing perfectly dry in their mulched beds, 20 feet from the narrow stream of water flowing harmlessly along the gutter. She took another sip of coffee and clicked to the next video file on her laptop. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m., 3 weeks ago. The infrared camera clearly showed Karen's back gate opening and a figure in a dark hoodie slipping through the shadows toward the Johnson family's driveway. Sarah watched as the figure approached 17-year-old Marcus Johnson's pride and joy, a restored 1987 Camaro he'd been working on for 2 years. The hooded figure produced a key from their pocket. Sarah's eyebrows shot up. She'd always wondered how Marcus's car kept getting vandalized without any sign of forced entry. The scratches along the driver's side door, the sugar in the gas tank, the slashed tires. Marcus had been devastated each time, and his parents had been forced to file multiple insurance claims. She fast-forwarded to the next incident. Same time, same hooded figure, same key. This time, the person was pouring something into the car's interior. Sarah adjusted the video contrast and leaned closer to the screen. The figure pushed back the hood, and Karen Pemberton's face was clearly visible in the infrared glow. "Well, well, well," Sarah murmured, taking a screenshot. Her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Mrs. Chen. "Karen is outside telling everyone you're going to flood the basement. She's asking people to sign some kind of petition." Sarah looked out her front window and saw Karen holding court, with a small group of neighbors gesturing wildly toward Sarah's house. She recognized Bob Henderson, the Patels from the corner house, and unfortunately Marcus Johnson's parents. Time to even the odds. Sarah saved the video files to a flash drive, grabbed her keys, and headed for her car. As she backed out of the driveway, Karen's voice carried across the street. "There she goes, running away because she knows she's in the wrong." Sarah rolled down her window. "Actually, Karen, I'm heading to the police station to file a report." The group of neighbors went quiet. Karen's face flushed red. "About what?" "About the vandalism that's been happening in our neighborhood. Turns out I caught the perpetrator on camera." Sarah's smile was ice cold. "Amazing. What you can see with night vision." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about." Sarah put the car in drive. "I'll be back in an hour. Try not to flood anything while I'm gone." As Sarah drove away, she could see Karen in her rearview mirror, frantically waving her arms and trying to redirect the neighbors' attention back to the pool water. But Sarah had seen the doubt creeping into their faces, the way they'd started, looking at Karen differently. At the police station, Officer Martinez listened to Sarah's story with growing interest. The video evidence was undeniable. Karen's face was clearly visible in multiple shots, and the timestamps matched perfectly with the Johnsons' insurance claims. "This is actually a felony," Martinez explained, reviewing the footage on Sarah's auto. "Multiple counts of vandalism, criminal mischief, and since she used a key, it's also breaking and entering. How did she get access to the victim's car?" Sarah had wondered the same thing. "Marcus works part-time at Jiffy Lube. Maybe she had a key made there?" "We'll look into it. This is really excellent evidence, Ms. Mitchell. But I have to ask, why? Are you bringing this to us now? Some of these incidents are weeks old." Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment. "Honestly, I didn't realize it was Karen until this morning. I installed the cameras because of package theft, and I just never reviewed the footage from the backyard camera until today. After she threatened to sue me over draining my pool, I decided to check if my cameras had caught anything that might be relevant to her character. And boy, did they." Martinez made notes on his report. "We'll need to speak with the Johnsons and get their official statements. Can you email me these video files?" "Already done." Sarah had sent them from her phone while waiting in the lobby. "Perfect. We'll probably have a warrant for Ms. Pemberton's arrest by this afternoon. I'd recommend you go home and stay inside for the rest of the day. Sometimes people don't react well when they realize they've been caught." Sarah drove home to find her street blocked by a Channel 7 news van. Karen stood in front of the camera, her arms crossed defiantly, while a reporter held a microphone toward her face. "This is exactly the kind of environmental irresponsibility that's destroying our neighborhoods," Karen was saying. "One person's selfish decision to dump chemicals into our storm system could affect dozens of families." Sarah parked and walked over to the growing crowd of neighbors. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a determined expression, turned toward Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Jessica Chen from Channel 7 News. Would you care to respond to allegations that you've been illegally dumping pool chemicals into the municipal storm system?" Sarah looked directly into the camera. "I'd be happy to. I followed all city guidelines for pool drainage. The water was dechlorinated for over a week before disposal, and I have test strips documenting the chlorine levels. Everything I did was completely legal. Karen jumped in front of the camera. Legal doesn't mean right. The environmental impact... Actually, Karen, Sarah interrupted, her voice calm and steady. I think we should talk about environmental responsibility and community responsibility and what it means to be a good neighbor. The reporter sensed drama and leaned in with her microphone. What do you mean by that? Sarah pulled out her phone and showed the screen to the camera. I mean that while Karen has been accusing me of damaging the neighborhood, she's been systematically vandalizing our neighbor's property for months. Karen's face went white. That's ridiculous. I would never. I have video evidence, Sarah continued. Clear footage of Karen using a key to break into 17-year-old Marcus Johnson's car and damaging it. Multiple times. The police are reviewing the evidence right now. The reporter's eyes lit up with the scent of a much bigger story. Do you have this footage with you? I do. Sarah looked directly at Karen. Would you like to see it, Karen? Or would you prefer to explain to everyone why you've been terrorizing a teenager? Karen's mouth opened and closed silently. The neighbors began murmuring among themselves, pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicking into place. Marcus Johnson's parents pushed through the crowd, their faces darkening as they stared at Karen. You? Mrs. Johnson's voice was barely controlled. You've been destroying my son's car? This is... Karen looked around desperately, seeing suspicion and anger in every face. This is obviously some kind of setup. She's trying to distract from her own illegal activities. The only illegal activity here, came a voice from behind the crowd, is yours, ma'am. Everyone turned to see Officer Martinez walking up the street, his patrol car parked at the corner. He carried a folder in his hand and wore the expression of a man who'd seen too much neighborhood drama. Karen Pemberton? He called out. Karen's face crumpled. She looked at the news camera, at her neighbors, at Sarah's satisfied expression. This isn't over, she hissed. You have no idea what you've started. But as Officer Martinez approached with what was clearly an arrest warrant, Karen Pemberton's reign of neighborhood terror was about to end with the same dramatic flair with which she'd tried to destroy everyone else's peace. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that Karen's own insistence on documenting everything had led to this moment being broadcast live on the evening news. Karen Pemberton, you're under arrest for vandalism, criminal mischief, and breaking and entering. Officer Martinez's voice cut through the stunned silence like a blade. You have the right to remain silent. The Channel 7 camera kept rolling as Karen's world imploded in high definition. Her perfectly composed suburban mom facade cracked completely, revealing something desperate and ugly underneath. This is harassment! Karen shrieked, backing away from the officer. She set me up! That footage is fake! Ma'am, please turn around and place your hands behind your back, Martinez said calmly, clearly accustomed to suspects who believed their own lies. No? Karen's voice pitched higher. Dennis! Dennis! But Dennis Pemberton was nowhere to be seen. In fact, Sarah noticed he'd been conspicuously absent from Karen's morning drama entirely. Strange, considering Karen claimed he was a municipal engineering expert who would back up her flooding claims. Karen made a desperate play for sympathy, turning to the news camera even as Officer Martinez approached with handcuffs. This is what happens when you try to protect your neighborhood, when you stand up for property values and environmental responsibility. Marcus Johnson stepped forward from the crowd, his young face hard with anger. Environmental responsibility? You put sugar in my gas tank. Do you know how much damage that does to an engine? And the scratches, his mother added, her voice shaking with fury. My son cried over those scratches. He worked 2 jobs to afford that car, and you destroyed it for fun. Karen's eyes darted around the circle of neighbors, looking for any friendly face. She found none. Mrs. Chen shook her head in disgust. Bob Henderson looked like he wanted to say something very unpleasant. Even the Patels, usually quiet and diplomatic, were whispering angrily to each other in Gujarati. You people don't understand, Karen pleaded as Martinez cuffed her. I was trying to maintain standards, property values. Marcus's car was an eyesore. And Sarah's pool was legal, Sarah interrupted quietly. My pool was completely legal, unlike breaking into someone's car with a stolen key. The reporter stepped closer, sensing the story was far from over. Ms. Pemberton, how did you obtain access to Mr. Johnson's vehicle? Karen's mouth snapped shut, but the damage was done. Marcus pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen. I'm checking with my manager at Jiffy Lube, he announced. If someone made an unauthorized copy of a customer's key, that's a felony too. Karen's face went gray. Officer Martinez guided her toward his patrol car, but Karen had one last card to play. Wait, she called out desperately. What about the flooding? The environmental damage? She still dumped thousands of gallons of chemicals. Sarah had been waiting for this moment. She pulled out her phone and opened the city's water management app, then held the screen toward the news camera. Here's the real-time data from the storm drain sensors on Maple Lane, she said calmly. As you can see, flow rates are completely normal. The system is handling the discharge exactly as designed. She swiped to another screen. And here's the chemical analysis I had done at Aquatech Labs yesterday. The report clearly showed chlorine, levels well below drinking water standards. I wanted to be absolutely certain before draining. Karen's final argument collapsed like a house of cards. The neighbors began talking among themselves, the pieces of months of mysterious incidents suddenly falling into place. Remember when someone kept leaving trash in the Chen's recycling bin? Mrs. Henderson whispered. And when the Patel's garden gnomes kept getting rearranged? The anonymous noise complaints about my son's basketball, added Mr. Johnson grimly. Always filed right after Karen had been out in her yard. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness watching Karen being loaded into the patrol car. This wasn't how she'd wanted to spend her Saturday, but Karen had forced her hand. As the police car pulled away, the crowd began to disperse. The Channel 7 reporter approached Sarah for a final comment. Ms. Mitchell, how do you feel about this resolution? Sarah looked at her house, at the nearly empty pool in her backyard, at the neighbors who were finally seeing their community, clearly for the first time in months. I feel like we can all go back to being actual neighbors now, she said. Instead of living in fear of someone who was supposed to be part of our community. The reporter wrapped up her segment, and the news van pulled away. As the street returned to its normal Saturday quiet, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Dennis Pemberton. Can we talk? Sarah stared at the message, then typed back, Of course. I'll be home all day. 20 minutes later, a man in his 40s knocked on Sarah's door. Dennis Pemberton looked like he'd aged a decade in the past few hours. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands shook slightly as he held a manila folder. I saw the news, he said quietly. About Karen. About the arrests. Sarah invited him in, offering coffee that he declined with a wan smile. I need to apologize, Dennis continued, settling into her living room chair like a man carrying the weight of the world. And I need to give you these. He opened the folder and pulled out a stack of printed emails. Karen's been planning this for weeks. The pool thing was just her latest obsession. Sarah scanned the emails, her eyebrows rising with each page. Messages to the city environmental department making false claims about Sarah's illegal chemical dumping. Requests to local news stations about environmental crimes in suburban neighborhoods. Even a draft complaint to the EPA about systematic groundwater contamination. She was building a case, Dennis explained, his voice hollow. She wanted to force you to move. She's been doing the same thing to other neighbors for months. The Chens, the Johnsons, anyone who didn't meet her standards of what the neighborhood should look like. Sarah set down the papers, feeling sick. Dennis, why didn't you stop her? I tried. His laugh was bitter. But Karen doesn't listen to anyone when she gets an idea in her head. She just gets more elaborate, more convinced that she's saving the neighborhood from people like you. People like me? Dennis met her eyes. Single women, minorities, teenagers with loud cars, anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. The scope of Karen's campaign was staggering. She'd filed false noise, complaints, made anonymous reports to code enforcement, even tried to get the Johnsons' basketball hoop declared a safety hazard. The car vandalism was new, Dennis admitted. When I found out about that, I knew I had to turn her in, but she got arrested before I could get to the police station. Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions, anger at the months of harassment, pity for Dennis, and relief that it was finally over. "What happens now?" she asked. Dennis stood up, leaving the folder on her coffee table. "Now she faces the consequences, and I file for divorce." The finality in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a marriage recovering from a rough patch. This was a man who'd finally seen his wife's true nature and couldn't live with it anymore. "Dennis," Sarah called as he reached the door. "Are you going to be okay?" He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "You know what's funny? For the first time in years, I think I might be." After he left, Sarah sat in her quiet living room, surrounded by evidence of Karen's systematic harassment campaign. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of suburban Saturday afternoon, kids playing, lawnmowers running, neighbors chatting over fence lines. For the first time in months, it sounded like peace. But as Sarah would soon discover, Karen Pemberton's story was far from over. Because while she sat in a holding cell waiting for arraignment, Karen was already planning her revenge, and she knew secrets about Willowbrook subdivision that would make everyone wish they'd minded their own business. 3 days later, Sarah woke up to find her driveway covered in official-looking documents, citations from the city, notices from the EPA, a lawsuit from something called the Willowbrook Environmental Protection Coalition. Her phone had 17 missed calls from reporters, and her email inbox was flooded with messages from lawyers, activists, and what appeared to be a documentary filmmaker. Sarah stood in her bathrobe, staring at the paper avalanche, when Mrs. Chen hurried over from next door. "Sarah, honey, have you seen the news?" "What news?" Mrs. Chen held up her tablet, showing a headline that made Sarah's blood freeze. "Suburban whistleblower exposes toxic cover-up. Local woman reveals decades of illegal chemical dumping." The article featured a jailhouse interview with Karen Pemberton, who was now being portrayed as a heroic environmental activist who'd been silenced by a corrupt neighborhood conspiracy. "She's claiming the whole subdivision is built on contaminated soil," Mrs. Chen explained, her voice shaking. "She says the developers knew about it and covered it up, and now everyone's pools and gardens are poisoning the groundwater." Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Channel 7 News. "Don't answer it," Mrs. Chen advised. "They've been calling everyone." Karen gave them a list of co-conspirators who supposedly helped hide the contamination. "Your name is at the top." Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. "That's insane. I've lived here for 3 years. I had nothing to do with the development." "Logic doesn't matter when someone's telling a story people want to believe," Mrs. Chen said grimly. "Environmental cover-ups are hot news right now." By noon, Sarah's quiet street looked like a disaster zone. News vans lined both sides of Maple Lane. Protesters with signs reading "Toxic Truth" and "Justice for Karen" chanted outside the subdivision entrance. Someone had spray-painted "Poisoner" across Sarah's garage door. The worst part was that some of her neighbors seemed to be buying into Karen's narrative. Bob Henderson wouldn't make eye contact when Sarah waved. She'd seen the Patels packing their car like they were planning to leave town. Sarah's doorbell rang constantly. Reporters, lawyers, environmental activists, and angry residents from other parts of town who'd heard about the contamination cover-up. She stopped answering after the 5th person accused her of murdering children with toxic pool water. That afternoon, her phone rang with a call from Dennis. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he said without preamble. "I had no idea she was planning this." "Planning what exactly?" Karen's been researching the subdivision's history for months. She found out that this land used to be a textile factory in the 1960s, and there were some environmental issues when it was demolished. All properly remediated. All legal, but she's twisting it into some conspiracy theory about ongoing contamination. Sarah sank into her kitchen chair. "And I'm supposedly the ringleader?" She's claiming you knew about the contamination and that draining your pool was part of a scheme to hide evidence. She's saying all the homeowners are in on it, but you're the one who recruited everyone to stay quiet. That's completely insane. I know, but Karen's always been good at making insane things sound reasonable. She's got documents, environmental reports, even some old newspaper clippings about the factory closure. She's weaving them into a story that sounds plausible if you don't look too closely. Sarah watched through her window as a news crew interviewed a woman holding a sign that read, "Kids before profits." The woman was pointing at Sarah's house and speaking with obvious passion about protecting children from toxic exposure. "Dennis, how do I fight this?" "I'm working on it. I contacted the original environmental firm that did the remediation work. They're willing to provide updated soil and water testing to prove the land is safe. But it's going to take time." Time Sarah didn't have. Her phone was already ringing with calls from her employer, asking about the news coverage and whether she'd be able to continue working with clients given the controversy. That evening, as Sarah sat in her darkened living room watching news vans camp outside her house, she realized Karen had played the ultimate long game. She'd turned her arrest into martyrdom, her harassment into activism, and her lies into a cause that people wanted to believe. But Karen had made one critical mistake. She'd assumed Sarah would crumble under pressure, just like she had during her divorce. What Karen didn't know was that Sarah had spent the last 3 years rebuilding herself into someone who didn't back down from bullies. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing. If Karen wanted to play the media game, Sarah would give her a masterclass. The next morning, Sarah's own video went viral. She titled it, "The Truth About Willowbrook: How One Woman's Lies Became a Neighborhood Nightmare." In it, she methodically dismantled Karen's environmental claims with actual data, showed the vandalism footage that had led to Karen's arrest, and provided documentation of Karen's months-long harassment campaign against multiple families. But the real bombshell came at the end, when Sarah revealed something Dennis had mentioned in passing. Karen had been planning to sue the subdivision's developer for millions of dollars, using the contamination claims as grounds for a class action lawsuit. "This was never about environmental protection," Sarah said, looking directly into the camera. "This was about revenge, harassment, and ultimately fraud. Karen Pemberton tried to destroy my neighborhood to line her own pockets." The video exploded across social media. Environmental groups that had initially supported Karen began distancing themselves. Legal experts weighed in on the attempted fraud. Most importantly, other neighbors started coming forward with their own stories of Karen's harassment. The Johnson family revealed that Karen had been threatening to report them to Child Protective Services if they didn't control their son's noise violations. Mrs. Chen showed emails where Karen had tried to get her reported to immigration authorities for suspicious activity, which turned out to be her perfectly legal home daycare business. The Hendersons produced recordings of Karen's threatening voicemails about their property value violations. By the end of the week, the narrative had completely flipped. Karen wasn't an environmental whistleblower. She was a predator who had terrorized an entire neighborhood and then tried to profit from the chaos she'd created. The final blow came when the environmental testing results were released. Not only was the soil completely safe, but the water quality in Willowbrook was actually above average compared to other developments in the area. Karen's contamination claims were utterly fabricated. On Friday morning, Sarah stood in her driveway as the last news van pulled away. The protesters were gone, the spray paint had been cleaned off her garage, and Maple Lane looked like a normal suburban street again. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Johnson. "Pool party this weekend? Heard you're getting a new one installed." Sarah smiled. She was getting a new pool, a bigger one, with a deck and everything. She'd also gotten a promotion at work, thanks to her supervisor being impressed with how she'd handled the media circus. Several neighbors had apologized for doubting her, and the Homeowners Association had voted to install a community garden in the empty lot at the end of the street. As for Karen, she was facing charges for fraud, harassment, filing false reports, and attempted extortion. Dennis had filed for divorce and was moving to another state to start fresh. The twins would be staying with his parents until the legal issues were resolved. Sarah looked at her backyard where contractors were already breaking ground for her new pool. This one would be even better than the first, partly because she could afford the upgrade, but mostly because she'd never have to worry about Karen Pemberton again. Sometimes the best revenge was simply living well, loudly and completely legally, in your own backyard. The neighborhood barbecue that weekend was the largest Willowbrook had ever seen, and when Sarah finally drained her new pool the following autumn, she threw a block party to celebrate, complete with Channel 7 News covering the annual Willowbrook Pool Drainage Festival, where neighbors gathered to celebrate responsible water management and community solidarity. Karen Pemberton watched the coverage from her jail cell, finally understanding that her war against the neighborhood had only made it stronger. Her attempts to divide and conquer had instead united people who might never have spoken to each other otherwise. In the end, the only thing Karen had successfully flooded was her own life with the consequences of her actions.